In a multiple slaying at a sorority house, a single bite mark is the only evidence. Can detectives use it to build a case against the most notorious serial killer of all time? Investigators hunt for a sexual sadist in a Canadian resort town. He leaves behind a trail of victims, but few clues. Can they stop him before he strikes again? Someone's murdering men on Florida's highways. A bloody palm print suggests a woman's touch. But who is she? What prompts some intelligent people to become cunning killing machines? As forensics tries to break their chain of death, psychologists seek to understand serial killers' fatal compulsion. On a February night in Pensacola, Florida in 1978, police officer David Lee saw an orange Volkswagen leaving the parking lot of a closed restaurant. Because the car had no reason to be there, he ran a check on the tags. He discovered it was stolen. The driver tried to flee the scene. After a chase and a struggle, he was apprehended. Police found stolen credit cards and several fake IDs in the car. The driver was taken in for questioning. The man flashed a student ID, but police determined that it too was stolen. After 2 days in custody, he finally decided to tell police his real name, Theodore Robert Bundy. At first, the Pensacola police had no reaction. They had no idea who Ted Bundy was. But they'd soon find out that his name had just been added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He was suspected of killing 36 young women in at least 4 western states. His lackluster arrest in Florida was the beginning of the end for the most notorious serial killer in history, who may have murdered over 40 women in 16 years. Ultimately, forensics would tie him to his crimes. In the process, the study of his murders would help spawn a whole new field of forensic psychology, a science that tries to understand how serial killers are created and what we can do to stop them. William Hagmeyer of the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit in Quantico, Virginia, interviewed Bundy in prison.
He was probably the most efficient killing machine that we've seen amongst the serial murderers that we've studied. With his ability to articulate how he made certain choices, why he let certain people live and die, he's become a standard by which other serial killers are measured.
So enormous were Bundy's crimes that they defied traditional crime-solving tactics. It wasn't until after he was caught that the pieces began to come together. Bundy didn't know that Florida would be the last stop on his trail of death. He arrived on January 7th, 1978, after escaping from a Colorado prison where he was awaiting trial for murder. He rolled into Tallahassee and moved into a boarding house called the Oaks, near Florida State University. It's now a fraternity house. Bundy didn't kill randomly. He was methodical, selecting college-age women with dark, straight hair parted in the middle. His proximity to campus provided ample quarry. Within a week of his arrival, he resumed his deadly rampage. At the Chi Omega house, sorority sister Nita Neary returned from a date around 3 a.m. on January 15, 1978. The lock to the back door had been broken for weeks. As she entered the house, she heard a commotion upstairs, someone running. She stopped as she saw a man run down the steps and disappear into the night. Then she realized someone was hurt. At 3:15 a.m., the campus police answered a frantic and garbled call for help from the sorority house. Bill Taylor was one of the first officers to respond.
We had stopped and broke up a fight between two of our fraternities, and we were just clearing that call when we got a call that two girls were in a fight at the Chi Omega house at 661 West Jefferson Street.
The campus police thought this was just another routine call. But nothing could prepare them for what they found. The house mother told the officers two women had been attacked. After calling paramedics, police investigated the rest of the house. An officer found Margaret Bowman in her bed. She'd been bludgeoned, then choked to death with a stocking. Down the hall lay another woman. Like Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy had been sexually assaulted, then beaten. In his fury, the killer had left bite marks in her flesh. She died en route to the hospital. While paramedics tended to the injured, police tried to make sense of the scene. Officer Taylor had never witnessed anything so brutal.
You're thinking all kinds of different things when you're going through there, and just how in the world could somebody do what was done to those victims in that manner while they slept in their beds.
The women never saw their attacker. But Nita Neary, who escaped a similar fate by mere seconds, described him. He was of medium height, wearing a navy peacoat and a knit cap. He carried a club. The sketchy description provided little help. The killer left behind no evidence, not even a fingerprint. At Florida State University, almost every man became a suspect. Every woman lived in terror.
We knew we were looking for a white male. We knew we were looking for someone who was around 5'8", 5'10". We knew that he had a dark-colored kind of peacoat kind of jacket on with a one of those navy blue watch caps on. You were looking at everybody that was walking, or everybody that you could see. Did he match that? Where could he be now? You know, is he hurting somebody else now? You get that horrible feeling that there's more, that something else is going to happen. Are there other crime scenes? Are there other people that are injured, other people hurt that we don't know about yet?
By then, Bundy had already moved 100 miles west to Lake City, Florida. There, he changed his tack and pursued a different kind of prey.
Yeah, he's just in the back there. Yeah.
He lured 12-year-old Kimberly Leach into his van.
Yeah, he's right in the back.
They drove off. Leach would be Bundy's last victim. After ditching the stolen van and killing the girl, he stole a Volkswagen. He was partial to them because the passenger seat could be removed to accommodate his victims. But before he could strike again, he was picked up by Pensacola police for driving a stolen vehicle. Bundy's past was catching up with him, courtesy of the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Florida police were almost certain he was responsible for the Chi Omega murders, but they had to gather evidence to prove it.
Or 7 if this is a bicuspid to
The only clues collected at the Chi Omega murders were the bite marks on the body of Lisa Levy. Investigators hoped they would be enough. The task of analyzing them fell on forensic odontologist Richard Souveron.
When Bundy was arrested, and the bite mark evidence was not considered a high priority. But when the detectives in the case were unable to come up with anything else, such as blood, fingerprints, hair, fiber, anything like that, then they decided, well, we'll give this a try.
At the time, bite mark evidence had not been used in Florida courts, but investigators had no alternative. Fortunately, one of the bites left a deep impression. Dr. Souveran saw that the killer's teeth had distinctive characteristics. They were crooked, chipped in several places, and had an unusual configuration. But he needed an impression of Bundy's teeth to make a match. That required a search warrant based on probable cause that Bundy's teeth were similar to the killer's. A snapshot of Bundy showing his teeth convinced a judge to sign the warrant. Souveran could now take the impression of Bundy's teeth. From the impression, Souveran made casts. It was apparent that Bundy's teeth were very unusual.
Bundy's teeth are unique. I've never seen a set of teeth like Bundy's, and indeed, no one in the world has a set of teeth like Bundy's. Turned and bit a second time, and here's the lateral incisor.
Most striking were Bundy's lower teeth, which showed an unusual pattern of wear, along with a distinct layout. The top teeth were chipped.
Both sides, and the teeth fit.
Using acetate overlays of Bundy's bite pattern, Souveran was able to conclude that only Ted Bundy's teeth could have left the bite marks found on the body of Lisa Levy.
Drop in.
Especially with that eccentric bite of his, that's pretty compelling.
Based in large part on this forensic evidence, a Florida grand jury indicted Bundy on July 27, 1978, for the 2 Chi Omega murders. His indictment was read on live television.
Let's go.
Theodore Robert Bundy, you are charged, indictment, 2 counts burglary and 2 counts murder in the first degree, 3 counts attempted murder in the first degree.
My chance to talk to the press.
Contrary to section 78204 Florida statute.
I'll plead not guilty right now.
And your grand jury...
Bundy, always wanting to be in control, enjoyed the attention and turned his trial into a media circus.
Well, listen, I've been kept in isolation for 6 months. I've been kept away from the press. I've been buried by you. You've been talking for 6 months. I think it's my turn now. All right?
We got a court order that there won't be any press interviews.
Sure there won't be any press interviews. You've given them out. I'm gagged, you're not.
Okay. Captain Proctor will read your
I'll
right.
be heard.
Emphatically denying his guilt, acting as his own attorney, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders, as well as the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach.
Ted Bundy was caught in large part because he was a terrible driver, and an alert police officer in Pensacola picked him up. He was convicted in large part because of forensic odontology. He rarely left any forensic evidence at his crime scenes because he knew what the police were looking for. He didn't know that the science of forensic odontology advanced to the point where a forensic odontologist can testify with tremendous accuracy that bite marks on a victim, as with Ted Bundy, matched Ted Bundy's teeth. He didn't know that.
As Bundy sat on Florida's death row, he began to trade information in order to postpone his execution date. He confessed to a string of murders throughout the West and provided details about how he committed them. He painted a graphic picture of the evolution and slow deterioration of a serial killer.
To become a serial killer is to become a serial tennis player, a serial jogger. When you get away from it for a while, you start getting the itch to get back. He said the itch was getting tremendous. The clock was ticking.
Experts suspect Bundy may have started killing in 1962, at age 15. Then, beginning in 1974, he killed 8 college women in and around Seattle. On crutches, or with his arm in a sling, he used his seductive charm to lure his victims. In this way, he snared 6 women in 6 months.
Ted Bundy felt that this victim had a choice. She didn't have to come with me. And as he said on many occasions, I wasn't a caveman killer. I didn't go and drag them out. You know, they came to me.
Emboldened by his success, he sought more risky prey during a crowded weekend at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle. 2 of the women at the lake that day, 23-year-old Janice Ott and 18-year-old Denise Nosland, apparently left with the injured stranger 4 hours apart. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. Based on eyewitness descriptions, police artists made a composite sketch of the slender young man with a Canadian accent who called himself Ted. Part of Bundy's success was his cunning. Part was his looks and outward behavior. No one could have suspected his homicidal inclinations. Seattle writer Ann Rule has made a career studying killers and their victims. In 1975, when she was just starting out, she was hired to write a book about the Seattle killer. Little did she realize that he would turn out to be someone she knew.
And I thought, gee, that looks like Ted Bundy. And I know that Ted sometimes affects a Canadian dialect. I knew that he lived in a boarding house on the same street where 2 victims had been found. But they were looking for people with a criminal record. And Ted Bundy, the only thing they had him for, 2 citations for bravery, for helping citizens. He'd been assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Council, worked for the governor of Washington. Not the kind of guy you're going to focus on.
Ann had met Bundy in 1971, 4 years earlier, when she volunteered at a crisis clinic in Seattle.
I was a civilian volunteer, and they would always pair us with a work-study student. And just through the luck of the draw, my partner was this very nice young man who was then about 23, named Theodore Bundy. So I spent 2 nights a week for a year, locked up alone all night long with Ted Bundy.
The weekend following the abductions, the beaches at Lake Sammamish were strangely empty. Over the next several months, bodies of women who disappeared began turning up in the nearby hills. Police in Washington intensified their search for the killer. 12 women had gone missing in the Seattle area, all suspected to be victims of the mysterious Ted. But Bundy was smart enough to know when to move on. In September 1974, he made his way to Salt Lake City. Over the next month and a half, 3 teenage girls disappeared without a trace. Then, on November 8th, Bundy spotted 23-year-old Carol Duranch. Posing as a police detective, he approached her and told her that someone had been caught stealing something from her car. He asked her to look inside to see if anything was missing. She told him everything seemed to be there, but Bundy asked her to accompany him to police headquarters to see if she could ID the thief anyway. Though Duranch was skeptical, she did as he asked. But as soon as she got into his Volkswagen, the trap was sprung. He handcuffed her and threatened to kill her on the spot. But she managed to get the car door open. She broke free. Duranch was the only woman that we know for sure to escape the clutches of Ted Bundy. But Bundy was unfazed. Over the next several months, more women would die. In Utah, Bundy was finally caught on a traffic infraction. Carol Duranch picked him out of a lineup. He was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years. He was then extradited to Colorado, where, based on hair samples found in his car, he was charged with the murder of a young woman. And there, through a small hole in the ceiling of his prison cell, he escaped to kill again. 8 days before the Chi Omega murders, Ted Bundy fled Colorado and headed to Florida. A friend loaned him money to live on. He'd been incarcerated over a year, and his fatal compulsion grew all the while.
This need to fill the addiction had grown so strong because he'd been in prison and unable to kill, but sitting there fueling his fantasies, thinking about it. And when he was out, he had no control over it.
Bundy was now taking chances, making mistakes. Gone was the kindly stranger ploy. At the Chi Omega house, he attacked with violence and rage, and left behind the clue that led to his conviction. Bill Hagmeyer believes that Bundy's recklessness was inevitable. Serial killers become more daring and less predictable over time.
Many serial killers, in fact, all that I've dealt with, their crimes start out as personal agendas, so to speak. The first victim may be an accident, it may be a displaced aggression, but after that, it becomes predatory.
Once he was in prison, Bundy provided the ultimate case study in serial killings. Hagmeyer set to work trying to understand where a killer's fatal compulsion stems from. Bundy himself helped interview other serial killers on death row to find a common denominator. The answer isn't clear-cut. In background and behavior, serial killers are just like the rest of us.
Serial killers come from different backgrounds. There is no consistent factor that I'm aware of in all their development. Basically, if one were to look at Ted Bundy's evolution as a human being, they would be shocked that he became a serial killer because he didn't act any differently, didn't appear to be maturing any differently than other children around him.
Writer Ann Rule believes that killers like Bundy are born and bred.
I think to create a serial killer or any sadistic sociopath, you have to have a combination of a genetic predisposition toward violence. Just like some people can play the violin, some people can tap dance, but these people have a tendency toward violence. Now, if that child is born into a loving home where he feels safe or she feels safe, we'll never know. But if you have the terrible synchronicity of the genetic predisposition and an abusive home, then you have the perfect soil to grow one of these people.
Bundy showed his homicidal tendencies as a young child of 3. His Aunt Julia, who was then a teenager, awoke to find Ted slipping butcher knives into her bed.
But as with most serial killers, it came down to a matter of choices. We're all a product of our environment, our genetics, our experiences, and what we become in life, whether it's a career choice, making a choice of a mate, or our avocation, and his just happened to be murder, we're accountable for that.
Bundy discovered in his early 20s that he was illegitimate. He aspired to a higher station than his stepfather could afford, becoming active in local politics. But rejection by a college girl of breeding and refinement may have filled him with smoldering rage. When he began killing less than a year later, all of his victims would bear a resemblance to the girl who'd rejected him. As Agent Hagmeyer spent more time with him, Bundy began to call him his best friend. Bundy shared what it's like to be a serial killer.
He said, when you're alone with a victim who's very much alive and vibrant and pleading for their life, he said, you become God. He said, you have the power over life and death. And he said, when you kill them, you hear the last noises that they'll ever put out of their mouth. You can basically taste the last breath that comes out of their body. And he said, there's a phenomenal feeling of power over that. And he said, that's what you feed off of after a while.
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, I mean, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible.
Bundy was convicted of killing 3 women and confessed to killing more than 30 others. Police will never know if that was a boast or a conservative estimate. He received his final punishment on January 24th, 1989, in Florida's electric chair. Hungry for that sense of godlike power, serial killers feel compelled to murder. But they don't always kill their victims. Sometimes they marry them. On June 29, 1991, 2 canoeists were spending a lazy afternoon on Lake Gibson near Niagara Falls, Canada. The waters had receded, revealing several blocks of concrete speckled with black paint. When one of the men stepped on a block, it broke in 2. He was horrified at what he saw. Inside were the severed limbs of a human body. Police found body parts in each of the 8 blocks. It took 2 weeks to obtain the dental records to identify the victim. She was a teenage girl named Leslie Mahaffey, who disappeared 2 weeks earlier from the nearby city of Burlington. Whoever killed her had also sexually abused her. It was a shocking crime in a country unused to violence. Placed in charge of the investigation was Vince Bevan of the Niagara Regional Police.
Once we knew who the victim was, we had, almost a month's lag time in there, so we had to go back and start to retrace to find out, who she was with, what the circumstances were of her disappearance, and start to work back from the city of Burlington to see if we could find any clues that would point us in the right direction about how she met her death and ultimately wound up in the concrete in Lake Gibson.
But there were no witnesses and no clues to the killer's identity. Forensic scientist Mike Kershaw began by looking at the concrete blocks, gingerly sifting through the rubble, hoping to find some piece of helpful evidence.
I examined approximately 700 pounds of concrete, and just the examination using the light sources I spent probably close to 120 hours on. Some of the things we were hoping to find included items that might have come from Leslie Mahaffey, like jewelry. We were also looking for evidence such as saws or saw blades. But what I've been finding is hair, fiber, hair that doesn't look or looks foreign to the concrete itself or foreign to Leslie Mahaffey.
Chemical analysis determined that the concrete was a ready-mix brand so common it was impossible to trace. The paint was a black spray paint. The trace evidence consisted of hair that matched the victim and several strands of different light-colored hair. Kershaw had nothing to compare it with. The forensic evidence was not adding up to much. The search for the Niagara killer took on a new urgency when another young girl named Kristen French was reported missing. She left her school on April 16th and was last seen walking past a church. She never arrived home. 2 weeks after Kristen French disappeared, a scrap collector discovered her body. She'd been sexually abused and killed in much the same fashion as Mahaffey. For Vince Bevan, it was now clear a serial killer was at work, and his increasing boldness was cause for alarm. Kristen French had been abducted at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a parking lot near a busy street.
For somebody to abduct her from that particular area, it's unusual because of the high level of risk that offender would have taken. I mean, there are any number of things that could have happened to interfere with what his plan was. And it's not a desperate act by any means, but it is certainly an above normal level of risk for an offender of this type.
The first break in the case came from 75 miles away in the town of Scarborough. For 2 years, police there worked unsuccessfully to catch a serial rapist. Acting on a tip, in 1990 they'd visited Paul Bernardo, an accountant who resembled the man described by some of the victims. He seemed an unlikely suspect.
When you think of somebody who could be responsible for crimes like this, you expect them to be marked in some way, like a hunchback dragging one leg behind him.
As a matter of procedure, police collected blood and saliva samples from Bernardo for DNA testing. He was one of 1,500 potential suspects, and in these early days of DNA testing, the process was time-consuming. It took an overworked Canadian forensics lab 2 years to complete their analysis of Bernardo's DNA. Meantime, Bernardo moved from Scarborough to Niagara in 1991. The serial rapes in Scarborough had suddenly stopped. The killings in Niagara had begun. When the DNA results came back in February 1993, they proved Bernardo was the Scarborough rapist. Scarborough authorities notified Niagara police.
We could have had an opportunity to connect those offenses earlier in the investigation. But as it was, that connection wasn't made until the DNA probe came back with Bernardo.
Bernardo was arrested for the rapes in Scarborough and the murders in Niagara. He denied the murder charges, and police had no sure way to connect him to the killings. If Bevan wanted a conviction, he needed tangible proof. He obtained a warrant to search Bernardo's house. A search team spent 10 weeks looking for hair, blood, fingerprints, any physical evidence showing the presence of the murder victims.
They got on their hands and knees with a stereo microscope and searched tuft by tuft until they started to find hairs, and they actually found small clippings of hair that were unique to Kristen French.
Along with the hair, police found traces of DNA from French and Mahaffey. Autopsies revealed that both victims had been drugged. In a desk drawer, investigators found a tranquilizer that Bernardo's wife, Carla Homolka, had obtained from the veterinarian's office where she worked. On a videotape Bernardo made for insurance purposes, police found an inventory of his basement. More clues came into focus. First was a circular saw, one that matched the type police thought he may have used to dismember his first victim. The next clue on the tape was equally incriminating.
And as he panned across the basement floor, showing some of the tools that he had, he went past an open cupboard. And in the top shelf of this cupboard were 2 cans of spray paint. One had a gray lid, one had a black lid. When we went in and executed the search warrant, and during our search, we were unable to find that black can of spray paint.
Besides the evidence on the tape, investigators noticed gouges on the stairs to his basement. Microscopic examination revealed black paint marks. Forensics experts created concrete blocks similar in size to the ones that contained Mahaffey's body. They spray painted the blocks and pushed them up a similar flight of stairs. The marks they made matched those on Bernardo's stairs. The forensic evidence was piling up, but it was all circumstantial. The case was clinched with the help of a surprising eyewitness. In January 1993, Paul Bernardo's wife, Carla Homolka, left him. She would later tell police that Bernardo had tied her and forced her to act out the last moments of his victims' lives. Fearing she would suffer their fate, she fled. In February, as evidence was mounting against Bernardo, she decided to make a deal and confessed that she herself had played a role in the heinous crimes of Paul Bernardo, crimes that he had videotaped. Karla Homolka had met Paul Bernardo in 1987 when she was still a teenager. Bernardo was a handsome, apparently successful young man 6 years older than she was. But beneath his pleasant exterior, Bernardo was possessed by a desire to subjugate women. Roy Hazelwood, a former FBI agent and an expert on sex-related crimes, has spent 6 years studying the strange bond between serial killers and the women who fall in love with them. Canadian prosecutors called on him to assess Karla's state of mind. Hazelwood believes Bernardo, like many serial killers, saw women as lesser creatures that didn't deserve respectability.
That explains why they go for nice middle-class women rather than prostitutes or alcoholics or drug abusers, because they want to tear down that image of niceness and purity, if you will, that surrounds a nice middle-class person.
As a teenager, he began spying on women in the dark. They became objects that existed only for his pleasure. According to Hazelwood, Bernardo saw his future wife, Karla Homolka, as a woman he knew he could dominate, forcing her to his will.
These men have an innate ability to identify women who are vulnerable, women who are naive, women who have few life experiences or low self-esteem, or they have, as I mentioned earlier, dependent personalities where they crave and need the attention of others and the approval of others.
Karla's parents encouraged her romance with the handsome, upscale Bernardo. By 1990, he already had her under a horrible spell. On Christmas Eve, she helped him drug her own sister, Tammy, so he could have sex with her. But the drug had induced her death instead. They said she drank too much alcohol. No one suspected the truth.
There's no question that Bernardo had manipulated her. She was an attractive, intelligent young woman. Why she ever became involved in the first incident is sort of a mystery to me. But I think it's quite clear that after her sister's death, she was trapped. She had trapped herself, in essence, in a situation that he could take advantage of.
On the night of June 14, 1991, 6 months after Tammy's death, Bernardo went out to stalk young women. According to what he told Karla, he saw Leslie Mahaffey locked out of her house at 2 a.m. He offered his assistance, then lured the girl to his car with the offer of a cigarette. Karla told police Paul had forced her to videotape his sexual assaults on Mahaffey. Paul and Karla were married 2 weeks later. The day police discovered the body sealed in concrete. Over time, Bernardo had tightened his grasp on Karla, drawing her deeper into his crimes.
Because she's in love with him, and because she wants his approval, because she wants to please him, she agrees to participate, and eventually it becomes more and more bizarre.
Karla helped her husband kidnap Kristen French in April 1992. She'd pretended to need directions, asking the girl to show them where they were on a map. Bernardo sneaked up behind her and shoved her into the car. Once again, according to Homolka, she had participated in and recorded Bernardo's sexual assaults on video. But where were the tapes? Despite 10 weeks of searching every corner and crevice of Bernardo's house, Canadian police were unable to find them. They'd discover later that Bernardo, in jail, had his lawyer remove them. When the tapes were finally turned over to the police, they validated every shocking detail of what Karla had said. Bernardo used the tapes to experience his crimes again and again. The videotapes, along with Karla Homolka's testimony, were more than enough to convict Paul Bernardo. He was sentenced to life in prison, no chance of parole. For her part in the crimes, Karla Homolka was sentenced to 12 years in prison, a sentence based on her testimony prior to finding the videotapes. But the tapes clearly showed Karla participating in the torture and sexual abuse of the victims. Was Karla truly a victim herself, or a savvy accomplice who worked out a sweet deal with the police?
Is she a victim? Not in the sense that she's not responsible for what she did. She certainly is responsible for what she did. And she needs to be punished for her activities in which she acted in concert in the abduction and or murder of 3 different people. So in that sense, no, she's not a victim. Is she a victim in the sense that she came under his spell? Is she a victim in the sense that he abused her? In that sense, yes, she's a victim in that sense.
From the first of Paul Bernardo's rapes to the day of his capture, almost 6 years had gone by. According to Ann Rule, if he hadn't been caught, he would have continued to kill.
They start maybe 2 or 3 years apart, and then it's 1 a year, and then it's 1 a month, and then it's 1 a week, until toward the end they need more and more of the substance that they crave to make them feel normal. And in the case of serial killers, it's murder. First they do it to get a high, and then after that they seem to need it, and they're almost all caught because they begin to take chances in the end.
Slowly, painfully, experts are learning the warped rules of the sexual serial killer. But do the same rules apply when the killer is a woman? In December 1989, along a Florida highway outside of Daytona Beach, officers found an abandoned car registered to a Tampa man named Richard Mallory. He had been missing for several days. Another week and a half went by before the 51-year-old Mallory turned up. Naked, shot several times with a .22 caliber pistol, and abandoned 2 miles from where his vehicle was found. Police sealed off the area to search for clues. Investigator Larry Horzepa of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office led the investigation.
At the time, we weren't exactly sure what we had, so as in all of our homicide investigations that we do, we did an entire sweep of the area and basically collected up everything that we could possibly find that we thought may be connected with the crime.
But investigators found very little evidence pointing to the killer. The investigation was stymied by lack of clues. As Volusia police worked on the case, police in 3 other counties struggled with murders of their own. Immersed in their local crime scenes, they had no knowledge of the other killings, no idea they were connected.
We didn't know about the other killings that had been occurring for almost a year. Basically, we were operating solely on ours.
As the body count climbed, police became aware that a deadly pattern was developing throughout Florida. Finally, the separate police departments pooled their resources.
We found the similarities in the fact that all the men were older men, being over the ages of 45 years of age, that they were basically all traveling alone, that they were traveling the major highways. We found that the bodies, all of them were discarded close to a major highway, and the fact that the vehicles that they had were placed somewhere else.
The killer had been methodical, consistent. All but one of the victims had been shot in the torso with a .22 caliber pistol, a relatively small firearm. In every case, the driver's seat was pulled up close to the steering wheel. The evidence suggested the killer was a short person, possibly a woman. If this were true, it was one for the books. There'd never been a female serial killer. or at least not one that police knew of. But at this point, it was just a guess. The killer had been thorough, wiping off all fingerprints. Then, on July 4th, 1990, a woman reported to police that she saw a car crash through a fence, then drive off. In the car were two women, a blonde and a shorter brunette. A few miles away, a car matching the description was found abandoned. Witnesses at this scene also described the two women. The car's registration revealed that it belonged to Peter Sims, age 65, an itinerant missionary who'd been missing for almost a month. Police saw a possible connection to the string of homicides. The car was turned over to Merv Stevens of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
The vehicle had been basically wiped down on the inside and outside. The crime scene analysts had went to the armrest on the driver's side of the car and had removed the armrest. Upon removing that armrest, they noticed what it looked to appear to be a palm print, a bloody palm print.
The single print was their only clue, and a potentially damning one. But prints in blood are notoriously fragile. Forensics would have only one chance to read the imprint. Only one chance to link killer with crime scene. They could not afford to make a mistake.
I think they made the latent lift as a last resort. Once they had discovered what they thought was a blood print, or looked to be like a blood print, it was reddish brown in color. And in photographing it and using the different lighting techniques, a blood print will tend to dry out. Once a blood print dries out, it becomes real fragile. And simple moving it around, handling that type of item, the print will basically deteriorate and it will fall to pieces.
After the print was photographed, clear tape was carefully placed over it. With even greater care, the tape was slowly lifted. Any little bend in the tape would crack the print and compromise the lift. Once the print adhered to the tape, it was affixed to a white card. The technicians were home free. The lift was a success. They analyzed the palm print and compared it to those of known criminals in the state of Florida. Stevens found a match in a woman named Lori Grody. She'd been convicted on a weapons charge. Grody was also known as Cammie Green and Eileen Warnes. Because several of the missing automobiles had been burglarized, police began checking pawn shops in the hopes of finding the stolen goods. At one, they found a pawn ticket in the name of Cammie Green for a particular brand of camera and a radar detector, items missing from the car of murder victim Richard Mallory. Florida requires pawn shops to take fingerprints. Cammie Green's print from the pawn ticket was compared to the prints in Stevens' files. The prints matched. The bloody palm print and stolen items were now linked to a single person, a woman named Eileen Warnes. Investigators traced Warnes to Daytona Beach, where she was a part of the biker crowd. She hung out at a bar called The Last Resort, where she slept on these benches behind the bar. Undercover police kept her under constant surveillance until they could collect more evidence of her crimes. But when they learned that a statewide biker barbecue was scheduled for the next weekend, they were afraid they'd lose Warnes in the crowd. On January 9, 1991, police made their move and arrested her. A key found in her possession led police to a locker filled with items stolen from the murder victims. The case against Warnes grew stronger. Next, they pressured her friends for more information. To keep them out of it, Warnes confessed.
I shot him, and then I thought to myself, well, I might as well just keep on shooting. Because I got to kill the guy, because he's going to. gonna, go and tell somebody.
When she was convicted in Florida for the murder of 6 men, Warnes had the distinction of being one of the first female serial killers, deadly as the male. But why, beginning in December of 1989, had she become a killer, hitching rides with middle-aged men, suggesting sex for money in a secluded spot, then shooting them to death? Warnes claimed she'd acted in self-defense. It was a claim Larry Horzepa found difficult to believe.
I think as she was applying her trade, as she was going along, for whatever reason, whether she needed more money or whether she decided that this would just be easy pickings, at one point in her life, starting with Mr. Mallory, she decided to bring a firearm into play. And once she went ahead and fired that first shot and killed that first man, felt it was easy. And why not do it again?
Ann Rule has studied women who kill. She disagrees that robbery was the motive. She believes Eileen Warnes felt abused by the men in her life, and the killing was her attempt at retaliation. Her anger was typical of serial killers.
But of all the women that I have ever studied, she is the only one who seems to have a particular victim type, who has a particular MO, who's killing stranger to stranger, and fits into the serial murder pattern.
For Ann Rule, the most chilling aspect of serial killers is their lack of remorse for their crimes.
These people believe that they deserve to have anything they want that makes them feel better. It doesn't matter who gets hurt as long as they're happy, because they are real and the rest of us are paper doll characters. We don't feel the way they do.
With each murder, serial killers lose a little more of their conscience, making the next killing that much easier. As police departments throughout the country begin to share information, they can more quickly see the deadly patterns emerge. Then they can stop serial killers in their tracks. Police in Connecticut begin to suspect a missing woman was murdered. But how can they prove it when they haven't got the body? After a 14-year search, a skeleton is found in a well. Is there enough left to determine what happened? A homicide investigation stalls until a dead man helps solve the mystery of his son's disappearance. Hiding the victim used to be the key to getting away with murder, but no longer. Even without a body, forensics can tear the fabric of lies and expose the bodies of evidence. A dead body. It's usually the first clue in a homicide. But without a victim, how can police catch the killer? Without a victim, how can they prove a murder occurred at all? In December 1986, Connecticut State Police were faced with just such a challenge. Hela Crafts, a 38-year-old flight attendant, had disappeared from her home in quiet Newtown, Connecticut. She left behind her husband Richard and 3 children. Her disappearance came as no surprise to Richard. Hela had recently filed for divorce after discovering he was having an affair. The Crafts' nanny, Marie Thomas, was worried. Her suspicions grew when she noticed stains on the carpet near Hela's side of the bed. She called Hela's best friend, who in turn contacted Hela's lawyer. According to State Police Detective Joseph DeStefano, Hela may have feared for her life.
Hela explained to her attorney that if for some reason she disappeared or wasn't around any longer or something wasn't right, and not to take it as being a coincidence, that there was something wrong. And she had asked her attorney, please look into it. That is exactly what had happened. Hela did disappear.
Police questioned Richard Crafts. Though they knew his situation with Hela was rocky, he seemed an unlikely suspect. Besides his day job as a commercial airline pilot, Richard was a town constable, sworn to uphold the law. But as state investigators talked to Hela's friends, suspicions about Richard began to grow.
When people were asking Richard where Hela was, he gave several different answers. At one point he said she was visiting her mother. At another point I believe he said she was visiting her sister. At another point he said he didn't know where she was. Things that weren't consistent with what a husband would say if his wife was missing. That in itself created some suspicion.
Police had enough information to obtain a search warrant of Kraft's house, but not enough to charge Richard with any crime. They still didn't know if this was a criminal investigation or a wild goose chase.
At this point in time, we had no answers. All we had were questions.
They hoped to find some answers in the Kraft's bedroom. By the time they obtained the warrant, the room was virtually empty, apparently to get ready for new carpeting, but perhaps also to disrupt the crime scene. Meanwhile, Richard was on his way to Florida for Christmas, and miles ahead of the police. Something happened here, but had the suspect erased all the evidence? Some of the furniture was discovered in the basement. Before investigators could examine the bedroom, they called in a friend of Hela's to tell them how it was arranged. After the room was back in order, the forensics team found stains on one side of the mattress. Blood spatter expert Henry Lee was called in to interpret them.
The first time when you hit somebody, usually don't produce spatter. You only can create a wound. When the blood starts deposit around the injury area, from the capillary or a vein, now you have pool of blood. The second time you hit it, then you have spatter.
Lee was able to determine from the size and distance the stains spread on the mattress that the blood spattered at medium velocity. That told him a little about the weapon.
We know it's some blunt object, but I cannot tell you that's a hammer, an axe, or flashlight. Could be any type of this blunt object.
One thing Lee and investigators concurred on. They had found the crime scene, and it suggested bloody murder. A faint pattern of blood on Hela and Richard Kraft's mattress was enough to turn up the heat on what was, until then, a missing persons investigation. Now, police felt that Hela might be dead, and that Richard Crafts had killed her. But the proof was scant, shaky. They were relying more on instinct than evidence. If Mrs. Crafts was killed, where was her body? They'd have to do their homework.
The next level of the investigation was a review of paperwork that we had found in Mr. Kraft's background, particularly his credit card receipts.
On the roster of routine purchases, one line stood out.
We found that Richard Crafts had rented a wood chipper from the Darien Rental Agency in Darien, Connecticut.
Though it seemed like a shot in the dark, DeStefano's sergeant suggested that perhaps Crafts used a wood chipper to eliminate the body. DeStefano was skeptical.
My immediate thought was things like that don't happen. They happen on television, but they don't happen in real life.
He went to Darien Rental to see if it was even possible to use a wood chipper to dispose of a body. The rental agent showed him the chipper that Richard Crafts rented on November 18th, around the same date Hela Crafts disappeared.
Okay, essentially what we have then, we've got all the material being fed in through this end.
Right.
And it's coming in contact with the cutters on the wheel over here.
Yeah, which is spinning.
Now, about how thick is that wheel? About 2 inches?
2 inches, yes, sir.
And that's solid steel?
Yeah, it weighs about 900 pounds.
900 pounds. Those blades, one on either side. So once that wheel gets moving, nothing stops it.
No, not at all.
The only thing that happens is whatever hits that gets cut.
Yeah, you could throw a piece of steel in there, it wouldn't make any difference. It would cut it up.
You say that opens up about 12 inches?
About 12 inches, yeah.
So 1,200 RPMs with a 900-pound piece of metal, two 12-inch blades. No way anything's going to stop that.
Not at all.
Though the massive blade could make short work of anything in its path, the hopper could only accommodate objects up to a foot wide. It would be impractical to dispose of a body that way, but not impossible. It seemed far-fetched. But while DeStefano was investigating the wood chipper, other detectives spoke with town workers to see if anyone had seen anything that might resemble a clue. A utility worker reported he was out in the early morning of November 19th. He saw someone operating what looked to be a wood chipper on River Road, adjacent to the Housatonic River. That chance observation propelled an otherwise stalled investigation. Attention shifted to River Road.
When the investigators got to that location, they did in fact find wood chips on the ground. In exploring the area all the more, they found envelopes with Hela Crafts' return address on them. At this point in time, we had the feeling that we've got something here that's totally out of the ordinary.
Investigators gathered 33 bags of debris from the River Road area. The bags were sent to the police station to be poured over piece by piece. Anything that wasn't a wood chip or a leaf was set aside.
At first we would find one hair, and not knowing what to do with it, we took a bottle and we put the one hair in the bottle. We would continue on, we'd find an object that was harder than wood but softer than stone. So we felt that we'll start another bottle for items such as these.
Out of the mulch, a grisly scenario was taking shape. Based on these initial findings, a tent was set up to process evidence on site. Konstantin Karazoulis, the state's chief forensic odontologist, or dental expert, was called in hopes of locating human dental remains.
We would collect evidence and bring it into a tent, and we would put it through some water, through a filter, and look for things that were human parts.
Circumstantial evidence was piling up. The blood in the bedroom, the wood chipper rental, the unidentified fragments in the wood chips. But there was still no body, and without a body, there was no crime. They needed to find something more definite. Investigators knew they had to turn the case around, or a killer would walk. While evidence of a crime was turning up along River Road, police continued interviewing potential witnesses. One spotted a man with a wood chipper on November 19th on a bridge about a mile south of the River Road site. Divers were sent to the bridge to see what they could recover. The water under a bridge is the repository of all things broken and discarded. It's a dumping ground for vandals, and a place where unwanted possessions are tossed and forgotten. Most are mundane, but sometimes the unexpected turns up. Dan Lewis was one of the divers.
What we were looking for was anything that could have been used as a weapon. We were looking for anything any type of a container, and certainly any more body fragments. Underneath this bridge, there's many parking meters, road signs, shopping carts, the usual kind of things that you'll find discarded off of a bridge. I mean, something like a chainsaw or a type of weapon will be totally out of place. When they came up with that, we immediately knew that we may have something here that pertained to that case.
Like everything else in this case, the chainsaw's connection was tenuous. The tool was sent to Dr. Lee's lab to see if a link could be made. Meanwhile, a mile north at the tent, Detective DeStefano was making a gruesome discovery of his own.
I had just put some debris into the screen. I had rinsed it off, and my normal course was after I would rinse, I would go through it with my fingers just to make sure that it was totally rinsed. As I was going through, you develop a certain feel for what you're dealing with, and wood chips have a certain consistency about them. As I went through, I felt something that didn't feel like a wood chip. It felt slippery. And when I held it under the light, I found it to be the tip of a finger.
The evidence of the crime was becoming ever more apparent, but it still wasn't strong enough to prove Hela's murder or to name her killer. The pieces would start to come together in Lee's lab as the chainsaw was studied.
The chainsaw deposit in a river must have a reason. We initially don't know what's the significance and the linkage. But by examining the chainsaw, we found tiny fragment of hair. Under a higher power magnification, microscopic examination, we made a determination that's human. Not only human, we noticed this hair was bleached and dyed.
To Lee's assistant, Elaine Pagliaro, the bleached and dyed hairs were all too familiar. Over 2,000 of them had already been recovered from the wood chips and examined.
The roots were of something we call paintbrush type. This paintbrush appearance to a root is characteristically found when hair is in tissue, and then that tissue starts to putrefy, and the chemicals from the putrefaction affect the appearance of the hair root. So it ends up looking just like a paintbrush. That's important in an investigation such as the Crafts case, because it indicates that the hair was in tissue and wasn't from a beauty parlor and dumped alongside the road.
The hairs were then compared to hair from the victim's hairbrush, recovered from the Crafts house. They matched. The chainsaw was then taken apart. Inside the housing were blue-green cloth fibers and remnants of flesh and blood. The fibers were the same color and fabric as Hela's nightclothes. The flesh in the chainsaw proved to be human, and the blood type matched Hela Crafts. Now it was a matter of finding out who the chainsaw belonged to. The serial number was corroded from being underwater, but Elaine Pagliaro was able to restore it.
Because of the nature of the way metal is formed, the impression goes through several layers. So even if you scrape off the top layer, if you take away that scraped portion, you should be able to raise up the impressed areas below.
She applied a chemical to the surface of the plate, which dissolved the corroded layers of metal, revealing the serial number.
The number is E5921616. All my career, I remember that number.
The serial number was traced back to the dealership. The chainsaw had been purchased by Richard Crafts. The forensics on the chainsaw potentially linked victim and killer, but investigators still had to prove that Hela Crafts was truly dead. After combing the banks of the River Road site for more than a week, Dr. Karazoulis found the final piece of the puzzle.
And as I looked down, I noticed there was an object. And that object turned out to be a human tooth.
In forensics, this is the Holy Grail.
I knew I had everything that I would need to make an identification of a human being.
A comparison with dental records proved the tooth belonged to Hela Crafts. But it suggested more than that. Part of the jawbone was still clinging to the tooth, and part of the root was cut off.
If this tooth were just removed, you wouldn't see this type of a fracture, or you wouldn't see bone attached to it in this way. So I believe that some force broke this tooth from its seat in the jaw and crushed whatever it was holding to pieces.
That force could have been a chainsaw or a wood chipper. Richard Crafts could be connected to both objects, and now indisputably to the victim, his wife, Hela Crafts. The circle was closing in on the airline pilot. The condition of the tooth, coupled with the hair and skin evidence, was enough to allow the medical examiner to declare Hela Crafts dead 2 months after she disappeared. Based on the trail of evidence, police reconstructed the likely scenario of Hela Crafts' death. On the night of November 18th, Hela was preparing for bed when Richard struck her with a blunt object. He got rid of the bloody sheets, but left telltale stains on the mattress and carpet. He had already rented the wood chipper, probably for some legitimate purpose. Then he realized he had the opportunity to kill his wife and use the chipper to dispose of her body. But he knew the opening in the machine wasn't wide enough to fit a human torso. That's where the chainsaw came in.
This isn't something that you would do to an animal. It's just not something that you do. I mean, it's totally beyond the realm of what people do to each other.
Only 6 ounces of material from Hela Crafts' remains was ever recovered. Less than 1/1000th of a human body. But it was enough for the police to make their case.
Most people don't realize 2 things. Number one, the lengths to which the police will go to investigate a crime. And number 2, the power of forensics. They don't realize the new developments that have happened within the past few years that have revolutionized forensics in criminal investigation. It's incredible what can be done now when you blend science with investigation.
For his crime, Richard Crafts received a 50-year sentence. His unconventional way of disposing of the body proved to be his undoing, though it took a battery of forensics experts to prove it. But not everyone has access to those resources. One woman's desperate search for her sister would consume 14 years of her life. Ava Dehart was looking for a good time, but she fell in with a bad crowd. Her circle of friends was a motley group of biker wannabes, a touch of menace in the otherwise sleepy riverside town of Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1982. They hung out at a place called the Joker's Wild, a loose-knit gang with too much time on their hands. Ava's boyfriend was the leader of the group. His name was George Pasalis, but he called himself George Sparta. He was a man who was more feared than respected. Ava had dated him for 8 years. During that time, their relationship grew more abusive. Occasionally, she'd leave him, but never for long. On July 20th, 1982, Ava left her house to go to work at the Joker's Wild. That was the last anyone ever saw of her. After a day had gone by with no sign of Ava, her family contacted the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. Detective Billy Bowler explains the investigation.
When the investigation was first initiated, it was a missing persons report, and our sheriff at the time was chief of detectives and picked up the case. He followed through with, interviewed the family. He went to interview Pat Solis. Pat Solis produces a handwritten letter that was confirmed through family members that it was in her handwriting, more or less a Dear John type letter. I'm leaving, they had a spat, see you later, that kind of thing. I'm not coming back.
If George knew where Ava had gone, he wasn't telling. Neither was anyone else. With no leads and no clear signs of foul play, the sheriff's investigation could go no further.
I think Pat Solis, of course, was targeted as a suspect or an individual responsible right from Jump Street, but they had no one coming forward with any information. There was no, we had no body, we had no forensic evidence, we had no Ava Dehart.
And Ava's family had no consolation. Ava's sister Debbie suspected a conspiracy of silence among the gang at the Joker's Wild. She felt the police weren't taking the case seriously. She knew that if Ava was to be found, she'd have to go it alone.
The attitude was a bit hard to deal with in the beginning because I would take them a rumor that I heard or someone that said something, and they would contact me again and tell me they'd followed up on it, and then we'd go through this cycle, this whole roller coaster, emotional roller coaster of going to them and giving them information and then having nothing come of it. And it was very difficult to deal with.
Debbie was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Desperate to find her little sister, she bulldogged every member of the Joker's Wild gang, pumping them for information, taking copious notes. She knew her only hope lay with the surly gang of bikers who said they were Ava's friends. But no one would talk. They were all afraid of George Patsalis. The weeks unfolded into years, but Debbie endured, even though she was forced to realize her sister was probably dead.
My friends say that when I get resolve on an issue, that I don't let go. And I guess I'd wavered in my own heart and mind many times about what I always knew that she was dead, but I'd wavered in my own mind about what could have happened.
In 1996, a news story caught Debbie's eye. A story about a woman in a footlocker. Her remains were found in Frederick, Maryland in 1982, the same year that Ava disappeared. Identification techniques weren't as sophisticated then.
The body had been misidentified, and the new identification was a young girl, 22 to 26, the right height, the right weight. She was found within 4 weeks of my sister's disappearance and had been missing approximately, been in the trunk approximately for 4 to 6 weeks. And so I just really had a very emotional response to that.
The search for her sister would lead her to the largest collection of anatomical remains in the United States. In April 1996, renowned forensic authority Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington applied his expertise to putting a face on the lady in the trunk.
Well, that was then printed in the papers, and it turned out that Debbie Dehart, the sister of Ava Dehart, happened to see that in the newspapers, and she thought, could that possibly be Ava? Because Ava had disappeared in 1982.
Encouraged by the preliminary description of the lady in the trunk, Debbie acquired Ava's dental records so Owsley could compare them. But sadly, the dental work didn't match. The lady in the trunk was not Ava Dehart. Debbie Dehart's quest showed no sign of ending. But the lady in the trunk provided some unexpected help after all.
There was so much publicity surrounding it. There were TV people and media people pursuing me, and I did some interviews. And as a result of that, I started to get phone calls. People were interested again. And I got some anonymous calls, people with little bits and pieces of information, but information I had needed all along.
After 14 years of pushing, Debbie finally felt like she was making progress. She knew this could be her last chance. She hired private investigator Al Baker to help her follow up with the former members of the Joker's Wild gang.
We began making contact with various people, which Debbie was able to provide us with the names. She had done that thorough job as to know who was part of this group, how we could contact most of them.
Nobody knew anything definite. Many were still afraid of George Patsalos. But one name kept coming up, Barbara Campfield, the woman who became Patsalos' girlfriend after Ava and who eventually married him. One woman in particular said she helped Campfield clean up some blood at the Joker's Wild after Ava's disappearance. At the time, Campfield told her that the blood was the result of a fight. It seemed that Barbara Campfield knew something. But what? Debbie had already tried speaking with her, but got nowhere. Now Baker gave it a try.
I started off by introducing myself to her, providing her my card, giving her phone numbers, and calmly explaining to her that we were now in the investigation with the Dehart family and that we were not going away, that this investigation would continue, was not going to stop, and we were going to talk to everybody we could to try and find out where Ava was.
Baker kept pursuing Campfield. Realizing that Baker wasn't going to let up, she was persuaded to work out a deal. She began cooperating with Detective Bowler and the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. She directed them to an abandoned home site outside of town. Campfield told Bowler that on the night Ava disappeared, George Patsalos asked Campfield to help him dump something heavy down a well. He told her not to ask any questions. She never dared to.
The well was pointed out to us. We subsequently got a search warrant for the property, went there with the assistance of the state police and the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and called the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue folks to come help us actually in the excavation of the well.
After making sure the conditions were safe, the fire and rescue workers were slowly lowered into the claustrophobic depths of the well. The hole was less than 2 feet square and 19 feet deep. Soon, the workers were hauling up buckets of soil and debris, years of accumulated leaves and dirt that concealed whatever lay below. Then bones started coming out. They were laid on the ground beside the well so an anthropologist could see what they'd found and what was missing. It was clear the bones were human and female.
We found pretty much probably the best part of her whole skeleton in various pieces and forms as we brought those out. Really, they came out in 5-gallon bucket fulls at a time out of the well.
It seemed the mystery of Ava's disappearance had been solved. But were these truly her remains? A comparison of the jaw with Ava's dental records confirmed the terrible yet reassuring truth. Debbie Dehart's sister had been found.
Well, it's certainly better for us to have found her than to have never found her. I don't think we realized how deep the wound was or how it would never heal if we hadn't found her.
For the Deharts, and in the name of justice, Owsley was entrusted with determining how Ava had died.
My role is to state what the facts are And to do that, what you have to do is pay very careful attention to the skeleton, to the bones. And if you know how to read the bones, they just are, it's phenomenal what they can tell you. This particular skeleton of Ava Dehart, it tells you exactly what happened to her, and it also provides all of the clues that helped with the determination of her identification.
Owsley studied every inch, scrutinized every fracture to try to determine the cause of death. Was she murdered elsewhere, then dumped in the well? Was she killed by the 19-foot drop? Or was she still alive, trapped, and left to die? The injuries caused by the fall were restricted to the lower half of her body.
Fractures in the foot, the lower leg bones, the thigh bones, and the pelvis are the result of being dropped in the well. When she was dropped in the well, her feet hit the bottom, and that caused breakage of some of the bone. As the force goes up the shin bone, then it causes jamming at the knee joint. And in relation to this, then when you look at the distal end of the femur, these fit together like this, the force compresses into the distal end of the femur, and it causes this compression fracturing right here.
From the condition of her remains, Owsley determined that Ava was probably dead before she was thrown into the well.
This blow to the midface, where it actually broke 4 bones. It broke part of the right maxilla, the left maxilla, and both nasal bones. It just sheared the nasal bones off. And that's telling you that it's coming from her right to left, but it's also going up because there's a slight oblique angle here in the nasal bones. There's no sign of a tool or any being hit with a specific type of weapon. This is something that apparently was done with a fist.
There was not a part of the skeleton that didn't have some type of injury.
It was savage. That's the only way that you can classify it, because I think even the blow to the face would knock most people out. He was simply out to kill the girl.
George Patsalos, now living in Florida, was charged with the murder of Ava Dehart. At the trial, Owsley presented Ava's remains to the jury. Through his forensic interpretation, she was able to testify against her killer.
I think that Doug felt that the dramatic way that she died, that she would speak to the jury, that it would be Ava telling the jury look what happened to me. And I believe the Commonwealth's attorney used those exact words. Look what happened to me.
On October 8, 1997, George Patsalos was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. The case against Patsalos was solved through forensics, detective work, and second-hand accounts. But suppose a crime had no witnesses, no crime scene, and no trace of a body. In April 1992, a 13-year-old Chevette was towed into an impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. There, it joined the ranks of other abandoned vehicles, awaiting their date with the crusher. At the time, no one knew it, but this car held a terrible secret.
Got it. Go, John.
Everyone in New Albany, Indiana, knew that Eric Humbert and Jonathan Whitesides were the best of friends. They worked together in the U.S. Geological Survey, and they played together after work and on the weekends. So it only seemed fitting that John Whitesides was the last person to see Eric Humbert alive. On the evening of January 15, 1991, after a game of hoops with their co-workers, the two drove to the auto shop to drop Whiteside's truck off for repairs before heading home. But by 9:30 that night, Humbert still hadn't arrived at his house. Eric's wife, Missy, said she phoned Whitesides to see if he'd seen him. Whitesides told her Eric had left just a few minutes ago and assured her he'd be arriving home any minute. but the minutes turned to hours. At 2 a.m., Missy called Whitesides again. Eric still wasn't home, and she was worried. Jonathan said he'd be right over. Eric never returned. Though Missy had spoken to the police the day after Eric disappeared, she didn't file an official missing persons report until 2 weeks later. Their relationship was becoming strained, and she thought Eric may just have wanted a little time by himself. But now she felt something terrible had happened. Eric was gone too long. He wouldn't have left his 18-month-old son. That wasn't like him. Detective Keith Whitlow of the New Albany Police led the investigation.
We began interviewing co-workers. There was rumors that Eric may have had a girlfriend in another state. We checked with that person, and she hadn't seen Eric. So his disappearance was pretty mysterious to everyone. Not only was he gone, but also was his automobile. There was without a trace.
But something of interest did come from interviewing Missy's co-workers. Many said that Jonathan frequently picked her up at work. Some claimed that Jonathan and Missy were having an affair. Suspicions centered around Jonathan Whitesides, but there was not the slightest evidence that anything illegal had happened, nothing to link him to any wrongdoing. The two may have been guilty of indiscretion, but there's no law against that. Months went by. It seemed the earth had swallowed up Eric Humbert and his car. Meanwhile, Whitesides moved in with Missy and her son. Then, in April, 4 months after Eric was reported missing, a white Chevette turned up in a state impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. Unclaimed, it was about to be sold or scrapped.
But they decided, as a matter of routine, to make one last check with the National Crime Information Center to see if this car was in fact stolen and whether they could have located an owner. When they did, they got a hit on the car showing that the car was part of a missing persons investigation right across the Ohio River from them in New Albany, Indiana. We were very, very close to losing a very key piece of the puzzle.
The car belonged to Eric Humbert. It was stripped of its tags. In the hatchback were traces of blood.
Hey, look at that.
Louisville detectives interviewed Whitesides, the last person to see Humbert alive.
Do you know who killed Eric Humbert?
No.
He consented to a polygraph exam.
Do you know where Eric Humbert is?
No.
He failed.
Did you kill Eric Humbert?
No.
When confronted with the results, Whitesides admitted he knew more than he let on. He told police that after the basketball game on the night Eric disappeared, the two men drove to the auto shop to drop off Whitesides' truck. Afterward, they drove to Whitesides' house to work on another car. From there, Whitesides' story took a bizarre twist.
He says that suddenly Eric went into a rage and accused him of having an affair with his wife and produced a knife, and that an altercation, a physical altercation between the two men developed there in the garage. During the scuffle, Jonathan claimed that Eric was accidentally stabbed in the throat, a wound which, according to Jonathan, proved to be fatal.
Jonathan panicked. He thought nobody would believe the freak accident. He loaded the body into the back of the Chevette, drove several miles to a remote spot on the Ohio River, and dumped it in. He couldn't recall exactly where he unloaded it. The police were skeptical of Whitesides' tale. After his statement, he was arrested while they checked out his story.
It just didn't pan out. It just didn't seem logical. We even had officers simulate the combat that he had described, and we found it very difficult to believe that it happened the way that he said that it did.
Unless the body turned up, the only physical evidence to prove or refute Whitesides' story was the blood-stained Chevette. The stains in the hatchback were consistent with a wounded body being stashed there. But one feature stood out. The trunk liner contained an unusual pattern, 5 lines of blood shaped like a chevron. Some blood-soaked object had been pressed against the liner, causing the marks. They were parallel, so they couldn't be impressions of fingers. The stain was notable, but meaningless, at least so far. Under the hood, investigators found a large spatter of blood. In it was a bright green fiber. No one could explain how it got there or what it meant. Inside the engine compartment appeared what looked like human tissue. It was sent off for analysis. Forensics expert Rod Englert was brought in to study the blood evidence. He found the fine mist of blood on the distributor cap wasn't consistent with a knife wound. He demonstrates.
What I'm going to do is take some blood here, and let's say that the end of this eyedropper is the end of a knife. And let's say that it has gone into my neck and I draw it back to maybe stab again, or I just pull it out very quickly. What it will cause is what's called cast off, and cast off is a resultant pattern that you see there. Now if you put these two together, as we have here, there's an enormous amount of difference between those two patterns.
A knife wound creates a cast-off that comes from one direction. But what Englert saw on the distributor cap was multi-directional.
And that only comes about through gunshot.
To Englert, the cloudy mist of blood clearly showed that Whitesides was lying.
That's the origin of that blood.
In Indiana, the pattern of bloodstains in Eric Humbert's Chevette raised doubts that he was stabbed in the throat. More doubts were raised at the forensics lab in Oregon, where the tissue sample collected from the engine was studied by Ray Grimsboe. Microscopic analysis revealed the tissue was human, but it wasn't from anyone's neck.
The arrangement of the cells, how the cells stained, told us that it was brain tissue. It was not from the skin or exfoliated tissue from some other area. This was neural tissue. We had to figure out then, how does it get out of a neck wound? And logically, it couldn't happen that way.
A closer examination of the car revealed a single bullet hole concealed at the base of the windshield wiper. 2 small fragments were recovered and sent to Grimsboe. He confirmed they were fragments of a bullet and its copper jacket. But most intriguing was the single tiny green fiber clinging to the bullet. He didn't know what to make of it. One thing was certain. The car was the scene of a shooting, not a stabbing. Whiteside's story wasn't washing. Seeking the truth, investigators went to the garage at the house where Jonathan Whitesides was living. The garage where he said his friend had accidentally stabbed himself to death. The crime scene was now 4 months old. Would anything be left? At first sight, the garage looked clean. But soon, a 9mm cartridge was found. Days later, a 9mm handgun was retrieved from Whiteside's work van. It seemed Eric Humbert had been shot. The brain tissue and the trajectory of the bullet indicated he was shot in the head. But something was missing. Something didn't seem right.
Well, we don't have a lot of blood spatter. Normally when someone gets shot in the head, we have blood and gore everywhere. In this situation, we had very little. So when we were able to identify that tissue, then as coming from brain, basically, the spatter, the bullet fragment, all tended to fit together. This person probably was shot through the head. And the question became, how'd that happen without getting it everywhere? Well, the small green fiber. I think that's when the little light went on in my head that we have a green fiber on this bullet. Bingo, that's why we don't have the blood. He had a cap on.
The weave pattern of the bloodied watch cap could also have made the chevron-shaped marks in the hatchback. The evidence so far was compelling and consistent. But was it enough to convince a jury the victim was truly Eric Humbert? All attempts to find a body met with failure.
Our body turned out to be a small piece of brain matter and some blood splatters.
The forensics team performed a DNA test on the blood. Problem was, they had nothing to compare it to. To go forward, they'd have to work backward. Blood relatives share similarities in their DNA. The forensics team counted on this to approximate Eric's genetic profile.
To identify Eric Humbert required just a paternity test, basically. We did a family history. We had his mother, his two living siblings, and his son and his wife. And so we typed them with DNA, and we took the unknown blood and the tissue from the scene, typed it.
To assure that the evidence wasn't contaminated, the DNA was tested simultaneously at 2 separate labs. The results were consistent, but investigators were still not satisfied. The forensics team needed to get DNA from both of Humbert's parents to be sure their findings were precise and irrefutable. Permission was obtained to exhume his father, who died several years earlier. DNA was extracted from his father's leg bones. The genetic codes from Humbert's father and mother were compared to the DNA from the blood in the Chevette.
We were able to show that, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this would have been consistent with a son of those two people.
Even without Eric Humbert's body, the prosecution had all it needed to convict Jonathan Whitesides. The prosecution alleged that on the last evening of Eric Humbert's life, he went to Jonathan Whitesides' house to help him fix his car. He may have suspected that his best friend was having an affair with his wife, but he couldn't have known how much his best friend wanted him out of the way. While Humbert leaned over his own car to show Whitesides how he'd made a similar repair in his Chevette, Whitesides pulled out a 9mm pistol and shot his friend execution style at point-blank range. He then loaded the body into the back of the car, disposed of it, and abandoned the vehicle. He thought that by eliminating the body, he'd eliminated all the evidence. He was wrong.
Whenever a criminal enters or leaves a crime scene, he always leaves something there. He always takes something with him. And I think that's very, very true. It's just today we are much more capable of finding those things that they take and leave than maybe we were just 10 years ago.
The jury deliberated only 45 minutes before finding Jonathan Whitesides guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. As for Eric Humbert, so far, his body hasn't been found.
Eric's mother told me after Jonathan was sentenced, she grabbed me by the arm and she said, "Please don't quit looking for him." And it's kind of ironic, every time we get information about a body found locally or something, it's like nobody has to say it, everybody goes, you know, I wonder if that's Eric. And not as of yet it hadn't been, but you know, we're still in some way, we're still looking.
Not too long ago, when victims went missing, killers went free. Today, the rules are changing. The laws of justice have allied with the laws of science. And even if the victim can't be found, chances are the killer will be. Investigators are on the trail of a serial killer who's leaving behind a series of almost invisible clues. In Maine, police depend on a few paltry fibers to sew up a case against a deadly rapist. The evidence is in hand, but they have nothing to compare it against. Florida investigators confront a fast car, a fatal accident, an unlikely story. Can forensic scientists use fibers from the crash scene to find out what really happened? Tiny filaments, practically invisible to the naked eye, are the key to solving these crimes. In the lab, scientists can weave the truth from the shreds of evidence. In 1981, a peaceful hike in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, ended with a grim discovery. The body of a young man was lying at the edge of a field. For Atlanta police, it was the kind of scene that was becoming all too familiar. For 21 months, more than 24 bodies had turned up in fields, empty lots, and less traveled roads. The victims were young African-American males. Some were children. Most were strangled. At first, the crimes were investigated routinely. But as the murder count climbed, it became clear a serial killer was on the loose. He would leave few clues in his deadly wake. Parents of the victims demanded answers. And as more bodies turned up, police assembled a task force to find a link among the murders and to trace every clue. But the murders continued. Lawmen from the surrounding area joined citizens, even psychics, in the search for victims and their killer. A reward fund reached $100,000, but no one came forward to claim it. Racial tensions grew as panic gripped this southern city. Assuming the crimes were racially motivated, police looked for a white male, and the outcry for justice in the African-American community grew deafening. As the death toll climbed past 20, investigators hoped it was only a matter of time before they caught the killer. But time was their enemy, and they had few clues. At the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, microanalyst Larry Peterson set his sights on the almost invisible clues known as trace evidence.
I began applying more or less full-time efforts into looking at the cases individually and also comparing them to see if they were related.
Peterson was counting on fiber evidence to be the common thread that bound killer and victims. By their nature, fibers are easy to pick up, hard to brush off. They provide a nearly invisible record of every place a person visits. By the same token, every victim was literally covered in hundreds of fibers, most of them meaningless. To find out which strands were important required a concentrated effort. Each fiber collected from one victim had to be visually compared against hundreds pulled from the next. Multiply that by 20 victims, and investigators were examining hundreds of thousands of fibers. The task could easily stretch into months.
It's hard to determine automatically what bits of material are important that could be from, let's say, a killer's environment, what bits of material is from the victim's own home, from places that they frequent.
Using a stereo microscope that renders the fiber evidence in 3 dimensions, Peterson analyzed fibers culled from the crime scenes and during autopsies. Their length, shape, and texture suggested some were from a household carpet, others were from an automobile.
I was still looking for any other kind of evidence that may link different cases together, in addition to the ones I had already found.
After scanning hundreds of samples, Peterson singled out fibers with similar characteristics. On most of the bodies, he kept coming across purple acetate fibers, as well as yellow-green fibers that appeared to be from a carpet. As the evidence began to accumulate, he needed more specialized microscopes. To see if they were from the same source, he placed the carpet fibers on a high magnification comparison microscope. It allowed him to compare the fibers side by side. Their colors and shapes matched. Peterson was encouraged. Perhaps that was the link he needed. He now had proof that all the victims were connected in some way, and that they were probably killed by the same person. If he could figure out where the fibers came from, he could catch the killer. Fortunately, the fiber had an unusual structure. If he could locate its manufacturer, he'd be that much closer to solving the case. That required comparing the fiber against the hundreds of samples submitted by carpet manufacturers, an interminable and painstaking job that would add more weeks to the investigation. He couldn't do it alone. Hal Dedman, the FBI's master microanalyst, signed on to help.
My initial role was to assist the Georgia Crime Laboratory in attempting to identify these fibers, to see if the manufacturer of these fibers could be identified.
While the search for the elusive fiber wore on, young men and boys were dying. And Atlanta was scared. As the city's anguish continued, Hyde Post of the Atlanta Journal covered the story.
The mood of the city during most of the investigation was a real strong feeling of helplessness.
Desperate for leads, Atlanta police canvassed victims' neighborhoods and streets near where bodies were found. They questioned people door to door, looking for any piece of information that might help them. At night, patrol cars searched the neighborhoods looking for anyone suspicious. On the streets, police had few leads, but in the lab, microanalysts were getting closer to pinpointing an original source for the unique fiber. The media caught wind that investigators were using trace evidence to tie the Atlanta area murders together. But publishing the news didn't stop the killer. It only made him change his tactics.
Suddenly, instead of in the woods or dumped by the roadside, the bodies began to show up in water.
The victims found in the rivers were either nude or partially clothed. Was the murderer trying to eliminate fiber evidence from being traced back to him? Lawmen suspected as much. Without alerting the media, and armed with the knowledge that the killer was now disposing of the bodies in water, scores of police recruits staked out Atlanta's bridges. They were fishing for a murderer that had eluded them for 22 months. Week after week, the recruits would secretly assemble under the bridges to keep their vigil. For all their efforts, officers dubbed them trolls. All they could do was wait for the killer to strike again. Around 2 a.m. on May 22nd, 1981, the calm along the Chattahoochee River was broken by a splash in the darkness. The trolls waiting under the James Jackson Parkway Bridge sprang into action to find the cause. But they could not see what made the splash. They radioed to nearby officers, who intercepted a station wagon and questioned the driver. His name was Wayne Bertram Williams, a 23-year-old freelance photographer and self-proclaimed music promoter. Williams didn't fit the assumed profile of the killer. In fact, as a young black man, he was more likely to be a victim. Williams told police he was coming home from a nightclub where he went to hear a new act he was considering signing. As a matter of procedure, police searched his car, then took his name and address and sent him on his way. Two days later, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater surfaced in the Chattahoochee River, downstream from the James Jackson Parkway Bridge. Cater, a black male whom the medical examiners determined had been strangled, fit the profile of the victims murdered in the months before. He'd been dead an estimated 2 days. The trace evidence collected from Cater's body was sent to Peterson. 2 fibers had been extracted from the victim's hair. In structure, they matched those found on the other victims. But the color didn't match. It could have faded from the water, or it could have been a mismatch. But viewing the fibers under polarized light revealed the structure of the fibers to be identical. Police decided to take a second look at Wayne Williams. After an interview and background check, a picture of Williams developed. He was a pampered only child, a college dropout at age 19. No one had seen him at the club he said he was at the night police stopped him on the bridge. Caught in this one lie, his alibi crumbled. Williams now became their chief suspect. They obtained search warrants for his house and car. Williams, feeling he had been wrongly accused because of his race, held a news conference to proclaim his innocence. But he didn't allow the press to take pictures.
They openly said, "You killed Nathaniel Cater, and you know it, and you're lying to us." They said that.
Some members of the African-American community also found it hard to believe that Williams could be considered a suspect.
I think it was very difficult for the community to believe that an African-American might have committed these crimes, that an African-American had gone about systematically killing other African-Americans. There was no history of black serial killers. Serial killers is a middle-aged white guy thing, or seemed to have been, and this ran counter to that pattern.
In the early 1980s, DNA testing wasn't available yet. All that forensic investigators had to go on were these small fibers. The strands seemed to point to Williams' guilt. His house was covered with yellowish-green carpet. Peterson collected as many fiber samples as he could. He also collected dog hairs and fibers from a purplish bedspread and from the trunk liner and glove compartment of Williams' car. Inside these bags of evidence could lie the key to catching the murderer. Peterson was hopeful that fibers from Williams' house would match fibers from the victim's clothing.
Took the evidence back immediately to the laboratory that very evening and mounted some of the samples up to see, does this have any potential or not? Let's just kind of see right away.
The violet acetate, along with the green carpet fibers from Williams' home, matched the fibers found on nearly all of the victims so far. But as strong as that evidence seemed, it simply wasn't enough. To make their case, investigators faced a staggering challenge: to determine how many other people in Atlanta had the exact same carpet. Based on the fiber evidence, Wayne Williams now looked like a strong suspect in the Atlanta murders. But anyone else in Atlanta with the same taste in yellow-green carpeting would be equally suspect. Police needed more to go on. They needed to find out how much of that particular yellow-green carpet was installed in Atlanta's homes. So they dug much deeper. Microscopic analysis of the fiber structure helped identify their manufacturer. The carpet was made in the early 70s, but that particular shade was produced for just 1 year. A little more than 16,000 yards of the carpet had ever been sold in the Southeast. In Atlanta, the calculated odds that someone owned the same kind of carpet as Williams were less than 1 in 8,000. The evidence was stacking against Williams, but not nearly enough to win a conviction. To narrow the field, investigators compared automobile carpet fibers found on some of the victims to the rug in Williams' car.
It was estimated that approximately 1 out of 3,500 cars in the Atlanta, Georgia area might be expected to have a carpet fiber like that found on many of the victims that were linked to Wayne Williams.
Put another way, the victims would have had to randomly visit 3,500 cars plus nearly 8,000 homes in order to pick up both fibers. The odds of that happening randomly were 1 in more than 29 million. Add to that the purple acetate fiber from the bedspread, and it became nearly impossible that the victims could have picked up these 3 fibers someplace else. The numbers didn't lie. Williams was arrested. To forensic scientists, the fiber evidence was overwhelming. To a panel of jurors, it might be confusing.
We wrote a story at the beginning of the trial that the prosecution's strongest case, strongest evidence, could be contained in a thimble.
More than just Williams was on trial. Prosecutors knew that the science that led to his arrest would also be scrutinized. The defense would do everything it could to snarl their credibility.
If you do enough searches and you find another environment where there's that same green carpet, what are the odds that there'll be an automobile that had the same floorboard carpeting, or that the family would possess the same blanket and bedspread and throw rugs and clothing items? That's really the key. That combination cannot exist.
On February 27, 1982, Wayne Williams was found guilty of killing 2 men. The jury deliberated 11 hours. 10 other murders were definitely linked to him during the trial, and the task force closed the books on 27 murder cases between 1978 and 1981, connecting them to Williams on the same fiber evidence. The Wayne Williams case was the first time a crime was solved solely on the basis of fibers. The amount and variety of fibers found on Williams' victims snared him in a net of evidence. But in a case in Maine, investigators had far less to catch a killer. November 30th, 1990 was a brutal day in northern Maine. On that day, a worker at the Cummings Concrete Corporation in Alton called police after discovering the body of a young woman. The victim was face down. She was nude except for the socks on her feet. The rest of her clothes were piled nearby. Police on the scene contacted Detective Ed Thorne of the nearby Bangor Police Department. They knew he was working on a month-old missing persons case, and the victim fit the description of the missing woman. The State Police Mobile Crime Lab was called in. Investigators were on the trail of a killer. Potentially important clues like tire tracks or footprints had to be quickly gathered before someone accidentally or intentionally destroyed the evidence. Maine State Police crime scene investigator Craig Hanley supervised collection of evidence. According to Hanley, the very act of arriving on a crime scene can compromise the minute evidence.
If the crime scene is not properly secured, we end up with contamination or inadvertent contamination, sometimes by the officers themselves. It's very important for us to interview the first responders and to find out exactly where they walked, what they touched, what they moved, and what they removed. And if they've done the job properly, they should have everything noted so they can explain this to us. There's nothing better than for a crime scene investigator to arrive on the scene and find it in a very good condition.
The scene's original condition was recorded on film, and notes were jotted down on paper. Soil samples and debris were collected. In a case that might hinge on microscopic evidence, there was no way of knowing what might become important. Investigators had two questions before them. Who was the victim, and who killed her? The body was taken to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy was performed and a positive ID could be made. Her clothing and physical features matched those of 18-year-old Lisa Garland, the missing woman that Thorne had been searching for. She had been reported missing 1 month earlier. The medical examiner later confirmed her identification through fingerprints. Garland was last seen around 1 a.m. on October 27th, leaving the convenience store where she worked. She lived only a short distance away. Bangor Police Detective Ed Thorne had reason to believe that Garland arrived at her apartment after she left the store. What happened then is an open question.
From there, she would have walked or got a ride down to her residence, which is approximately 150 yards from the store. We know she arrived because her pocketbook, her keys to the house, some money, and all her belongings were there.
The keys and valuables found in her house led police to believe that she had not left on her own. After a month, Detective Thorne and his colleague Bob Cameron saw their missing persons case turned into a homicide. The autopsy revealed the victim had been raped and killed by a blunt force to her head. Most of her internal organs were intact, preserved by the cool weather. At the Maine State Crime Laboratory, forensic chemist Chris Montagna analyzed trace evidence collected from the crime scene. Most notably, the socks the victim was wearing at the time of her death. He was hoping they would hold some small clue to the killer's identity.
We knew that one of the key pieces of evidence that we're going to be looking at are these socks. I began to process the socks simply by doing a visual examination, seeing what I could find, if there was any hairs or fibers, grass, anything that might be from the environment of the perpetrator.
He found maroon fibers. Experience told him they were from the carpet of an automobile. In terms of clues, it wasn't much. But Montagna felt the entire case could hang by this one thread of evidence. In July 1991, a 15-year-old girl was riding her bike on a lonely road in York, Maine, more than 200 miles south of Bangor. A car slowly approached and forced her off the road. She fell into the grassy embankment. The driver got out of the car and dragged the girl into the woods. There, he raped her, stabbed her, and left her for dead. Amazingly, she survived. After her attacker left, she found her way to a neighbor's house where she called for help. At the York Police Department, she picked out her attacker from the mugshot file. The suspect was a convicted rapist named David Fleming, who had been released from prison just 9 months earlier. In a state as quiet as Maine, news of violent crime spreads fast. After months of chasing dead-end leads to find Lisa Garland's killer, Detective Thorne heard about the violent rape in York. Bangor police became interested in David Fleming. Just maybe he had something to do with Lisa Garland's death. In York, DNA taken from the rape victim matched Fleming's DNA. Fleming pleaded guilty to raping and assaulting the young woman in York. He was sentenced to 80 years. The Lisa Garland murder case was still open. Bangor detectives believed that if they could match Fleming's DNA to samples collected at the crime scene, they'd have their man. But the DNA would have to wait. In the early 1990s, DNA testing could take months. Today, it takes weeks. If police were to prove that David Fleming killed Lisa Garland, they would need to rely on more conventional evidence. In this case, carpet fibers extracted from David Fleming's car. The fibers were sent to chemist Chris Montagna. He compared them with the ones found 8 months earlier on Lisa Garland's socks. Montagna placed each fiber on a separate stage of a comparison microscope to analyze them side by side. With a few adjustments, he could see that the pattern of dark and light stripes in the fibers lined up. When laid end to end, the fibers looked like one continuous strand, indicating that they came from the same source. It looked like the breakthrough investigators needed. The match allowed detectives Thorne and Cameron to trace 8-month-old evidence back to David Fleming. Detective Bob Cameron understood the importance of the fiber evidence.
The fiber that was found on the victim's sock, that was matched to the carpeting on the vehicle that Fleming had been driving. And it narrowed it down considerably because the fiber that matched to the carpet in the car was the only year that they had put that color carpeting in those vehicles.
The results were now conclusive. The fibers matched. But would this single shred of evidence be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? Fortunately, an overlooked piece of evidence was found in the victim's body bag. It was a small chip of wood, hardly worth keeping. But Montagna noticed that it had been squared off, leading him to believe that the wood had been machined. Successful once with carpet fibers, Montagna asked the investigators to again comb through Fleming's car, to look this time for a speck of matching wood. Inside the trunk, covered by a large cloth, lay small hand-carved wooden boats. Fleming learned to craft wood during his previous prison stints. Montagna sent the chip and the boats for analysis. The results again looked bad for Fleming. The chip was made of white pine, and so were the model boats. The wood had all been machined the same way. Now there were two strong reasons to link Fleming to Lisa Garland. The fiber evidence and the wood chip showed that Garland was in Fleming's car. But none of this evidence proved that he raped and murdered her. Establishing that Fleming killed her would be much more difficult. He appeared to have an airtight alibi. Around the same time Lisa Garland disappeared, he was in the hospital with serious injuries. Lisa Garland was last seen alive when she finished her shift at the convenience store in Bangor around 1 a.m. on October 27th. At around 6 a.m. that same day, David Fleming was involved in a car accident that left him hospitalized for 2 weeks. Fiber evidence showed that Garland was in Fleming's car. But to prove he was her killer, detectives had to pinpoint exactly when she could have been there. Fleming would have had two chances to abduct Garland. The first was in the 5 hours between the time she disappeared and the time he had his accident. The second was the 2-week period between Fleming's release from the hospital and when Garland's body was found. An examination revealed that she was killed shortly after she was raped, but the cold weather had preserved her body and made it impossible to determine how long she'd been dead. Police knew she could not have been in Fleming's car while he was in the hospital, and the car was being repaired. So if they could prove she was dead before Fleming was hospitalized, it would mean that Fleming was her killer. Police needed some way of narrowing the time frame. Bangor police learned that an aerial photo of the crime scene was taken 2 weeks before the victim's body was found. While examining the photos, investigators made a startling discovery. At first, it was blurry and indistinct, but an enlargement brought it into focus. There, in the pit, lay the body of Lisa Garland. Here was photographic proof that the victim was dead before Fleming was hospitalized. That meant she must have been in his car before his accident. The fiber had placed Garland in Fleming's car. The photograph established the time of death. All indications pointed to Fleming as the killer. Detectives Thorne and Cameron felt they now had all the evidence they needed to win a conviction. Then came the clincher. The analysis of the DNA from the crime scene came back from the lab.
The DNA test was done at the FBI lab, and the results were that Fleming was definitely a match.
At the trial, the events of that night were reconstructed by the prosecution, based on police speculation. Lisa Garland did make it home just after 1 o'clock in the morning on October 27th. David Fleming had followed her from the store. As she walked into her apartment, she forgot to lock the door behind her, a simple mistake that would prove fatal. David Fleming saw his opportunity. He then went into her apartment. It's not clear where he committed the crime, but fiber evidence proved that Garland's body was in Fleming's Delta 88 before he dumped it by the sand pit in the town of Alton. Fleming then returned home, where his girlfriend remembered him walking in around 3 o'clock in the morning. She recalled him not sleeping soundly and leaving around 5 a.m. About an hour later, Fleming got into an accident with an 18-wheeler. He was out of commission for 2 weeks, but the evidence showed he had already committed his crime. The fiber evidence linked the victim to his car. The photograph established an approximate time of her death. And the car accident closed his window of opportunity to just a sliver. On March 22, 1995, David Fleming was convicted of raping and murdering Lisa Garland. He is serving a life sentence on top of the 80 years for the rape in York. In case after case, fiber evidence has linked victims to their killers. But in a case in Florida, investigators relied on fibers to reconstruct the circumstances of a fatal car accident.
Was an emergency? Yes, some man just knocked on my door. He says he's had an accident and he thinks his friend's dead.
On a road in Tallahassee, Florida in 1994, a mild October evening turned terribly tragic. Strewn among broken beer bottles, snapped tree limbs, and mangled car parts lay the lifeless body of 30-year-old Michael Manella. A second victim, named Curtis Davison, was able to summon help before returning to the scene and collapsing. As paramedics treated Davison, Tallahassee police sized up the scene of the fatal accident. For crash investigators, time is even more critical than at a homicide investigation. At a homicide, officers can cordon off the crime scene and return to it later. Not so with a car wreck. Officers get just one chance to collect evidence. Traffic must return to normal as soon as possible. Crash investigators often rely on eyewitness accounts as a first source of information. But no one had seen this late-night crash. No one other than survivor Curtis Davison, and he was in no condition to make a statement. Crash homicide investigator Mike Walker had to rely on preliminary judgments based on the evidence he saw at the accident scene.
And what really struck me immediately was the passenger side of the vehicle was totally destroyed. The passenger door was nearly torn off the vehicle. We had an intact driver's side of the vehicle.
To Walker, that meant the passenger of the car would have sustained the most severe injuries. It was doubtful he could have survived, let alone walk away from the crash. But Davison told police he was the passenger. By some fluke, that may have been true. But could it be possible that Davison was lying to avoid being prosecuted for his friend's death? It was Walker's job to find out the truth. Investigators questioned anyone who might have seen the men before the crash. Witnesses told police that the two met at a local bar after work, where they had several drinks. They were then seen in another bar later that evening. Around 1 a.m., they left the bar and drove off together, but no one saw them get into the car. Without any witness, the detectives would have to rely on forensics to tell them who was driving. They first had to determine all they could about the crash and what factors were involved, like how fast the car was traveling. Returning to the crime scene the next morning, Walker and his partner, David Folsom, found the clues they needed.
The 300ZX suspect vehicle was traveling northbound on this road. As it rounded the curve, he began to lose control.
The driver turned the wheel to follow the curve, but the car's inertia kept it moving forward. As it left the road, it began to spin. Then it hit a tree.
The vehicle continued sliding sideways, striking another tree. As it struck the other tree, it went airborne approximately 40 feet, landing back in the road.
When a fast-moving vehicle changes direction, the tires slide sideways, leaving scuff marks on the road. By measuring these marks, called critical speed scuffs, and factoring in the friction of the road surface, investigators can calculate how fast the car was moving as it sped out of control.
The measurements from the critical speed scuff indicated that the vehicle was traveling at 89 to 96 miles per hour.
Almost from the start of the investigation, police had a hunch alcohol played a role. Broken beer bottles were found at the scene, and paramedics and officers detected alcohol on Davison's breath and on Manella's body. If Davison was the driver and was under the influence at the time, investigators needed to test his blood alcohol level, and quickly. A blood sample was taken within 2 hours of the crash.
So what time did you start? It's very important that once we establish that there's suspicion that he is the driver of a vehicle, then we have to obtain a blood sample because alcohol dissipates from the system.
Walker and Folsom ordered the blood work that morning. The sample was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab to determine its alcohol level. First, the analyst takes a carefully measured portion of the blood she wants to test and places it into a clean, labeled vial. The alcohol in the blood is volatile. As the blood is shaken, it evaporates into the air or headspace of the vial. It's the components of the blood in the headspace and not the blood itself that's tested. The gas in the headspace is drawn into a chromatograph, which identifies its components and their concentration. The computer looks specifically for alcohol in the blood gases. In 10 minutes, it provides a reading. The results showed Davison's blood alcohol level at 0.04, safely below Florida's legal limit. But that was the level when his blood was drawn at the hospital, not the level he had at the time of the accident. Because alcohol dissipates from the bloodstream at a consistent rate, the analyst can calculate what the level was 2 hours earlier when the accident occurred. Davison's level at the time of the crash was estimated to be between 0.06 and 0.08. In Florida, a level as low as 0.051 can be considered driving under the influence. But investigators still had to prove that he was behind the wheel. Back at his office, Walker pored over the accident scene photos and compared them to his notes. Parts of Davison's story weren't adding up. First was the car's restraining system. Walker recalled the driver's side airbag had been deployed. Airbags, by design, pin the driver in place. If Manella were driving, it seemed unlikely he'd have been thrown from the vehicle. Yet his body was found some 50 feet from where the car came to rest. On the other hand, the passenger's side seatbelt looked like it hadn't even been used. Whoever sat here could have been thrown. One more clue aroused suspicion. A bloody handprint on the outside of the driver's side door. It was too smudged to read, but it seemed likely it was made when the driver exited the car after the accident. But according to Folsom, the evidence could be misleading.
Now, traditionally, we cannot say that just because there's a bloody handprint that someone driving that car put it there, because there's such thing as scene contamination. One of the rescue personnel or one of the police officers could have done it. But it was enough to spur suspicion as to who was actually the driver, the deceased or the survivor.
By themselves, the evidence of a bloody handprint, minor injuries, and an unused seatbelt meant very little. Taken together, they created serious doubt about Davison's story. Davison, however, was sticking to it, insisting that he was the passenger. The definitive version of the tale would be told in the lab. Investigators faced no shortage of clues about the car crash that claimed a man's life. The trick was to make sense of them. Crash investigator Mike Walker had the wreck towed to a secure impound facility for analysis. Ward Schwob is an analyst at the Department of Law Enforcement lab.
One of the parts of my job as a crime scene analyst is to go and examine a vehicle without any outside influences. A lot of the times I'll go and look at the vehicle itself and try not to learn any of the particulars about the case. I'll take an objective view of the vehicle, see what I can determine, see what the evidence tells me.
To piece together the particulars, he began with the driver's side seatbelt, fastening it in a position as if someone were wearing it. He noticed spots on the seatbelt near the door. They tested positive for human blood. That indicated the seatbelt was probably worn at the time of the crash. It also meant that whoever wore it was probably not ejected from the car. Signs again pointed to Davison. The evidence was suggestive, but slippery. Even if the blood proved to be Davison's, The defense could argue that it could have spattered onto the belt while the car was spinning, or that Davison could have bled on it after the crash as he staggered around the car. To seal this case, investigators needed to find evidence that fit 3 criteria. First, the evidence could be left only at the moment of impact. Second, it had to be unique to the individual who left it. And third, it had to prove where that person was sitting in the car. Investigators depended on fibers to meet those criteria, and they depended on Regional Crime Lab microanalyst Paula Sauer to read them. Detectives Walker and Folsom gave Sauer several pieces of material evidence collected from the accident scene, including a dashboard with 2 dents in it and clothing worn by the victims. The dents in the dash were on the passenger's side. It was presumed they were caused by contact with the passenger's knees. Remarkably, the force of the crash created so much frictional heat that woven patterns and fibers were actually melted into the vinyl.
There were fibers, numerous fibers embedded in the dashboard area that would be directly in front of the passenger seat. These fibers were microscopically consistent with the fibers composing Manella's pants.
The evidence seemed to indicate that Manella was in the passenger's seat. But Sauer wouldn't stop there. She scrutinized every piece of evidence to be certain her results were consistent. She turned her attention to strands of human hair and synthetic fibers gathered from the cracks of the passenger side of the windshield. Michael Manella wore a hairpiece composed of both human hair and synthetic fibers. If the fibers from his hairpiece matched those in the windshield, it would strengthen the argument that he was the passenger and that Davison, the survivor of the crash, was driving. An inspection of the synthetic hairs using a high-power comparison microscope suggested the fibers in the windshield matched those in Manella's hairpiece. But analyzing these fibers required more than a visual inspection because of the small size of their molecules. To complete her comparison, Sauer used an instrument called a Fourier Transform Infrared Spectrometer, or FTIR.
It is an instrument that is used to determine the generic class of synthetic fibers. By generic class, I mean whether it's nylon, polyester, acrylic, and this technique is very effective in that manner because it's actually looking at the molecules that are making up those fibers, so it can give you an exact identification.
The characteristics of both fibers were displayed on a computer. The red lines represent fibers from the hairpiece. The green lines represent fibers pulled from the windshield. In every way, they were identical. So far, all indications were that Manella was in the passenger seat. If that were true, it meant Davison would have left his mark in the area of the driver's seat, most likely on the airbag, which would have deployed at over 100 miles per hour. Sauer analyzed fibers clinging to the tightly woven fabric of the airbag. She found 9 fibers matching the fabric of Davison's pants. Her conclusion? Davison was driving. Paula Sauer used her sophisticated optics to put the accident scene into focus. Not only had she placed Manella in the passenger seat, but also determined that Davison was the driver. The evidence was handed over to the state's attorney, who showed in court that Davison lied about the events that unfolded in the early morning hours of October 6, 1994. The prosecution's theory was that after a night of drinking, it was Curtis Davison who got behind the wheel of Manella's Nissan 300ZX. Anxious to test the sports car's power, Davison put it in high gear, racing down the tree-lined 2-lane road. Ignoring the 35-mile-per-hour signs, Davison climbed toward 90. Then the narrow road started to curve, and Davison lost control. No longer heeding the steering wheel, the car slid sideways and careened off an oak tree. Michael Manella, in the passenger seat, was thrown from the vehicle. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The sports car continued to spin out of control, smashing into another tree before coming to rest on the side of the road. Davison, saved by the airbag, crawled out of the car. He went around to the passenger side to look for Manella, his bloody left hand leaving a smear on the door. Manella was dead in the road. Davison went for help. A Tallahassee jury took just 10 minutes to find Davison guilty of manslaughter by culpable negligence. He was sentenced to 7 years. The analysis of tiny fibers, traces of evidence found in ordinary items, turned the tables on 3 men who denied any involvement in their respective crimes. The ability of forensic scientists to pinpoint the makeup of fiber down to the most microscopic detail allows prosecutors to tear alibis into shreds of evidence.